Georgia is a struggling democracy where Soviet tyranny is still fresh in memory. There are reports now of Georgian villages being razed, civilians being rounded up, and innocent civilians being shot. We've seen such things before, as in the Balkans and in earlier periods of European history. And now we must ensure that events in Georgia do not unfold into a tragedy of much greater scale. When young democracies are threatened or attacked and innocent civilians are targeted, they should be able to count on the free world for support and solidarity. If I'm elected president, they will have that support. I guarantee you that. And in cooperation with our friends and allies in Europe, we will make it clear to Russia's rulers that acts of violence and intimidation come at a heavy cost. There will be no place among G8 nations or in the WTO for a modern Russia that acts at times like the old Soviet Union. The Cold War is over, the Soviet Empire is gone, and neither one is missed. Least of all is that empire missed by the once captive nations of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, and Georgia. These brave young democracies have joined the free world, and they are not going back.
Let's get back to the situation in the nation of Georgia now, where Russian troops are making no signs toward leaving, at least according to the United States Department of State. Joining us now to talk about the prospects here, Fred Kemp, the author of the book Siberian Odyssey, A Voyage into the Russian Soul. He's also the Atlantic Council President and CEO. Fred, I know you've met with the Georgian ambassador recently. What does the ambassador think are the prospects of getting the Russians out?
I think the prospects of getting the Russians out aren't that great, and that's partly because we now understand why they're in. The longer this goes on, the clearer it is that this was long planned, carefully prepared, and then provoked. That's the most you can blame President Saakashvili of Georgia for, is walking into a trap. Since they're in for strategic reasons, they're not going to leave until they get what they want or until they feel that they have to leave for reasons of prestige, sanctions, or otherwise. And so I think what we're seeing is them digging themselves into places like the city of Gori, and then when they leave an area, the reason they leave an area is because they've created enough destruction, dismantling military installations, to a certain extent civilian infrastructure, before they then move on to a next target.
But what about the so-called peace agreement, the ceasefire?
I think you have now the president of Russia saying one thing and troops on the ground doing another thing. That's not good for a major country of the world where the president of the country is actually does not have credibility with his partners, and that's exactly what Secretary Rice has said herself.
The Russians are saying, hey, this is essentially like the invasion of Iraq, and we may need to stay there for a long time.
Well, we now are in a situation where you have a philosophical debate that's turned into a war. The West has been saying we're in a different world now. We have an integrated world, globally integrated world, where spheres of influence thinking, 19th century thinking, is outmoded. The Russians have been saying, you know, we're threatened by NATO encroaching on our borders. We think in these spheres of influence. Now that they've actually acted, it becomes less theory and it becomes more practice. What do we do about it?
It's going to be, I guess, interesting to see what happens. Fred Kemp. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you.
Joining me now from Washington is Frank Gaffney. He's the president of the Center for Security Policy. He's also a former deputy assistant to the Secretary of Defense. Frank, welcome. Good to have you here.
Thank you very much.
You know, we thought this story might be cooling off a little bit, but it is clearly not. As Steve Harrigan's been reporting and Greg Palcott's been reporting, there is no sign of a pullout. What do you think Russia is up to with agreeing to a pullout and then not going?
Increasingly, it's back to the future, if you will. They're looking more and more like the Soviet Union in the sense that they'll say one thing and do another. They'll engage in acts of even barbaric intimidation and violence in order to accomplish strategic purposes, while claiming that they're abiding by international law, or at least ceasefire agreements that they've freely entered into. This is, unfortunately, I'm afraid, what we're going to see a lot more of, most immediately at the expense of the Georgians, but quite possibly Ukraine next, and maybe others in the areas literal to the old Soviet Union that they aspire to take back.
You know, Frank, Ralph Peters wrote a piece this morning about these Chechen militants who are being employed by the Russian military to do this work. And they said, you know, there was a time when Russia wanted to disband this group, but they held on to them for some reason, and that caused a lot of people to be curious about it. They said, this is what Putin had in mind all along. He wanted these very brutal Chechen forces to do the dirty work for him in Georgia. What do you think?
Well, Ralph is a smart guy. This is sort of a foreign legion, if you will, for the Russians to deploy where they wish and have some measure of what's been called plausible deniability about their conduct. But they're operating behind Russian lines, areas that they've taken over, and they're being used to do some very dirty work indeed. And it's why I think we've got to be sending the message unmistakably to the Russians that there are real costs to this kind of conduct. Otherwise, we are going to see more of it, and that cost ought to be measured in things like, as John McCain has suggested, getting them out of the G8. They cannot do this sort of thing and be considered presentable, I should say, company in international circles. And it ought to go from there. If this continues, I think they should be out of NATO's special arrangement, and Georgia, for that matter, Ukraine, which is next, ought to be in. The sorts of things that we know could greatly increase the costs to Russia ought to be now taken, not simply talked about.
Putin has expressed in the past that there was a great deal of humiliation that was associated with the loss of these satellite areas of Russia, and he seems to be proving that he is very serious about fixing that in the eyes of many. Frank Gaffney, always good to talk to you. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Martha.
Overseas now, Russia's President Medvedev is pinning medals on servicemen, saying that they faced down the cowardly aggression of the nation of Georgia. Clearly, the public relations battle still very much underway. Russia's top military brass says that nation is beginning to pull troops out of Georgia. But take a look at this view from the strategic Georgian city of Gori. It seems to show Russian forces just staying put, holding their positions. Amy Kellogg is live in Moscow. What about these reports that the troops are moving? Amy, any truth to that?
Yeah, we get the same sense that you do, John, that really there isn't any movement, but no one's been able to independently verify exactly what's going on. Even though there are lots of reporters on the ground, John, it's really hard to tell exactly what's happening with the troops. One of the chief of general staff here in Moscow gave a briefing today. He was pressed about the time frame for the withdrawal, and his response was, John, I can tell you when New Year will be, but I can't tell you when the troops will be out. But I can tell you one thing, he said, they won't go out as quickly as they came in. John?
What's the mood on the ground there?
The mood on the ground, I understand, is quite tense. Every day, John, we hear news stories of atrocities. One thing is that no one knows exactly what went on in Skin Valley during the fierce fighting, and I think people are looking forward to finding out exactly how many died and what exactly happened. But we're hearing today that reports that South Ossetians are harassing ethnic Georgians who also lived in that enclave, destroying their homes, forcing them to do labor on the streets. These are reports from people who are on the ground there. We can't verify them with any certainty, but I think that there's a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty. We did hear something from President Saakashvili today that was somewhat conciliatory, in that he said once the troops come out, we really need to talk about working on Georgia-Russia relations so that we're not estranged forever. But it's hard to imagine, John, at this point how those discussions are going to go, and we know that there's going to be a NATO meeting tomorrow in which members are talking about how they plan to punish Russia for its aggression in Georgia. John?
Amy Kellogg reporting live from Moscow. Amy, thanks.